This is Journal 4.4, so we're in Unit 4 on evolution, and we've been talking about how organisms have changed over time. And one of the ways to know if organisms have changed over time is to use the fossil record. So it turns out that a true mystery organism, in this section of Unit 4 we're looking at how do we name organisms, how do we give them a name, and part of that is knowing if they're related to each other. So a fossil of an organism was found in Saudi Arabia, and it was dated to be between 420 million and 350 million years old. It stood to be about 20 feet tall. As taxonomists, or people who give names, taxonomy is these levels of classification. We'll see that in our notes today. As they tried to classify or group the organism, they noticed certain characteristics. It was multicellular, but did not move. It did not perform photosynthesis, but did have a cell wall. So it's not able to move. It doesn't perform photosynthesis. It's not an animal. It's not a plant. What is it? So if we look at what the taxonomists were examining, they were looking at physical characteristics. So if you need to pause the video so that you have time to think about what were they really studying about the organism? They were studying the organism's what? Their physical characteristics, and we actually know this as anatomy. But we don't always just want to look at the physical appearance. Sometimes we want to go back and look at like the genotype, so the DNA or perhaps the proteins. And this is called the organism's biochemicals. So these are two of the three categories that we looked at in Unit 4, anatomy, biochemistry, and physiology. They did finally place these organisms into the genus Prototaxites, but it needs a second name, and so maybe you know what that name is. So for example, humans are Homo sapien. The sapien is the species name. So perhaps you knew that already. The last part, I'm asking you to go ahead and figure out what this organism is. It's not a plant, it's not an animal. It actually starts with an F. And so see if you guys can figure out what this organism really is. And then your opinion question is on, do you think that funding this research is important? It turns out that the ACSPRF is the American Chemical Society Petroleum Research Fund. So why would they be doing research on these things that didn't move? They weren't plants, they weren't animals. Why were they doing research on them? This is the petroleum fund that actually gave these people the money to do this. So why might they be researching fossils? So if you need to pause this to finish up, make sure that you've answered the opinion question on why might researching fossils be useful, why might these people be paying for this research on this fossil. And then when you're done, if you'll look at your schedule, remember we're really going to try to use this week. Use your schedule, and we're going to classification notes on page 91. So you'll probably want to pause the video so that you can pull up your classification notes on page 91. So section 4.3, which starts on 91, is looking at speciation. So we want to circle this word, and we want to understand that organisms or populations of organisms change over time. And sometimes they are so different that they're now different species. Like in the article you read yesterday with the fruit flies. They got separated, they changed, and they could no longer mate. And so once we have different species, we do need to classify them or group and name them. But we don't want to just randomly give things names. We want the names to mean something. so these names need to be based on similarities. Well, does that mean that a bat and an insect should have a similar name? They both fly, so we just call them all flying animals. And so the very first classification system was by a man named Aristotle. I like to kind of underline the A because I think first. We do need to know he was the first one to even group organisms. And he basically grouped things into plants and animals. But we know that it's not that simple. We know that there are some plants, like the Venus flytrap, that actually eat part of their food. We know that there are lots and lots of different animals and that they're not all exactly the same. So what we need to do, what happened next, is that they tried to get more and more specific. So the modern classification system, we've changed how we classify things over time. The modern classification system was devised by a man named Carl Linnaeus. And we do need to know his name. So Aristotle was first, Linnaeus was second, and he created a system called the binomial nomenclature. And bi, like bicycle, bi means, two. Nome, if you have taken a different language, you might have seen this before. Two, name, and then this just means naming system. So what we want to know is that scientific names have two names to them, a genus and a species. And we do write it in a very specific way. So when we look at an organism's name like Homo sapien, the species name is second. And it is actually the most specific. So species, think specific. Only one type of organism can have that species name. The genus is this first word here. The genus is a little bit more general. Look at how the words are kind of related. Species, specific, genus, general. And so what we start to see is that some organisms will share their name. So one that we looked at yesterday that I do want you to write in your notes is Canis lupus. And notice how we're writing it. We're going to follow these rules. We're going to capitalize the first word, lowercase the second, and underline it all. So Canis lupus, and then we write another one, Canis familiaris. This is actually the wolf. This is actually the dog. So if I give you these three scientific names, you should be able to predict who is more likely to be related. Because they share part of their name, they're more likely to be related. Now they have to share it from beginning to end. So it turns out that this is one of 6 parts of the name. Thankfully, we only have to write 2. So what we're trying to get from this section is that we write 2 names as the scientific name. We include the genus and the species. There are 6 names, so most of you might have 3, a first name, a middle name, and a last name. In science, we're going to see that there are actually 6 or 7 levels. So taxonomy is the study of classification, and it's actually the levels of naming. So just like you have a first name, a middle name, and a last name, these organisms have many names. And so the highest level is called the domain. And this is going to be the most general, which means it will include a lot of diversity. So for example, when we look at eukarya, this is going to include plants. This is going to include animals. This is going going to include fungi, and this will include a group called protists. Archaea and bacteria, these are both prokaryotes. So bacteria is a common name. And so we do have these domains to help us group organisms. And you can kind of see it here in this picture as well. So when we study how to name an organism, we start really general, even more general than plants or animals. We say eukaryotes all have something in common. Of course, what they have in common is they all have a nucleus. So as we go on, we start to give them several levels of names. And so these are the 7 levels of taxa: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so one way to remember it is King Philip came over for grape soda, green soup, gold, and silver. There's all sorts of different ways to remember it. But what you need to actually learn is the order. So you need to learn how to put these in order. Now, domain actually does go up here, and that was only recently discovered. So what we want to know is that species is the most specific. There are about 2 million different species in the world. Kingdom is the most general. So if I start here and go down, this gets more specific. I could, of course, go backwards and go from specific to general. So you do need to be able to put them in order. So King Philip came over for grape soda, green soup, gold, and silver, any of those. And so what we see is we can group organisms. This is a great diagram because it shows that you've got all these different animals. And then you can look at the phylum Chordata, which means that they have a chordate, or an internal skeleton like your backbone. So a sea star or a starfish does not have that. And then we see the class Mammalia. Well, the snake is not a mammal, it's a reptile, so it gets excluded. And we get more and more and more specific until we get to the name of a single organism, Ursus arctos, which is the polar bear. The polar bear is related to the black bear. They share the same genus. So what you're going to do in the computer lab today is you're going to do some examples of this. You're going to work through kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So we really want to get good at using these words. You don't have to memorize the words, but you do need to memorize the order. And that's why this saying, King Philip came over for green soup, grape soda, is really, really helpful. So if you don't have that in your notes yet, go ahead and put that in your notes now. So it's there, so you just need to really highlight it. Okay, the last part really looks at what the species level is. So understanding that it's the most specific and it would only contain one type of that organism, and that they can interbreed, they can mate, and produce fertile offspring. Fertile meaning that the offspring can have babies too. So one example is with the horse and the donkey and the mule. The horse can mate with other horses and produce horse. The mule can mate with other mules and produce mules. But if a horse and a mule mate, they'll produce a donkey. It's a living organism, but the donkey is infertile. It can't produce any babies. So it turns out that sometimes we get hybrids, like a liger, a lion and a tiger, but those offspring can't mate. And so we don't call the liger its own species. So what you're going to do today is practice these words: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so you'll be going to the computer lab next.